Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Have you ever wondered how long it would take for a vampire bite to take all the blood from your body that was required and still leave you alive? Well, who hasn't, right? Well, the University of Leicester looked into this, and they decided that it would take about 6.4 minutes to take about 15% of your blood from your body, leaving you alive, satisfying the vampire. So there's the answer, basically. And today we're going to be looking at vampires. Our guest is Rosemary Ellen Guilley. But first we're going to talk to Anthony, who's been looking into vampires and the history of vampires, and to see what we can learn about these mysterious mythological creatures. I say mythological. Are they mythological? We need to look into this more. Let's go straight to Anthony. Anthony joins us from Almaty, Kazakhstan, near the origins of the foothills of the Himalayas, near the highest ice rink in the world. Hi, Anthony.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Not too bad, thank you. I've got a few questions to ask you.
Oh, yeah? What kinds of questions are these?
The first one is, do you have unusually pale skin?
I do actually, especially around kind of December, January when the suntan has faded. Yeah, I do look a little pale and ghostly.
Are you extremely energetic at night but extremely tired in the mornings?
Well, put it this way, we're recording this at around 2 a.m. so I'd say that's a yes, and I know how I'm going to feel tomorrow when I wake up.
Okay, that's an affirmative then. Can you see quite well in the dark?
Give me a few seconds to adjust my eyes, and I can, I'm okay. I can find stuff usually.
Just a couple more questions. Do you always feel a strong urge to travel?
Do I always feel a strong urge to travel? Wow, that's a trap. Yes, I do.
And can you hear a whisper from across a room?
If there's no ambient noise, then yeah, I suppose I could.
And the last question, and I think this, I can definitely answer yes to this one. Do appliances and computers often malfunction around you?
Yes, they do.
Right, well, I can confirm you're probably a vampire then, because these are questions taken from the vampire website. And there are others, but I think you're well on your way to becoming a vampire yourself, to be honest.
Yeah, it seems that way, doesn't it? I've actually seen a couple of Are You a Vampire questionnaires, and yeah, I pretty much pass.
I think I can answer yes to most of those as well. So I think that's probably why we're up at I'm up at 3 a.m. and you're up at 2 a.m. So that's I think it's quite valid that we're going to be talking about vampires today.
Well, yeah, it is indeed. It is indeed. I've been looking into the phenomenon a little bit. Obviously, it's been around for a long time, both, in the sense of people believing in the actual existence of vampires and as a kind of archetypal symbol in literature. With the literal belief, you can find accounts pretty much everywhere, and they stretch back a long way through history, except, weirdly enough, in Japan. Vampires only turned up there in the mid-20th century. But so, like a lot of things you can say about Japan, they're quite unique in that way. But as a brief example, we could look at New England, that little kind of Canada-like northeastern bit of the US. It's sort of an infamous area for people who are into the more macabre and grotesque side of life. Because you had the Salem witch trials there at the end of the 17th century, and also more recently, nearly all of Stephen King's books are set there. But there's also a big vampire tradition in the area. There was even there was something around the 1850s called the Great Vampire Panic, where people in New England went around digging up the graves of suspected vampires and dismembering them so that they couldn't rise from the dead. And this is far from a unique phenomenon. We'll see another example later. Historians aren't entirely sure what caused that panic, but one factor was definitely tuberculosis. There was an epidemic of it in New England in the 19th century, and it wiped out entire families. And the locals quite often blamed supernatural causes. So at least some of New England's vampires date back to that era. But I think the most interesting thing is that after the TB was wiped out, the belief continued, and it's still big there today. And it's the same in a lot of places. You know, if you look in Asia, for example, there's a whole spectrum of, you know, vampire creatures. In the Philippines, there are two, by way of example. They're both female. There's one's called the Mandarugo, which translates as bloodsucker. And, you know, during the daytime, she's just an attractive young girl. But at night, she transforms into this kind of hideous beast thingy with bat wings. And she runs around, sticking her tongue into people and stealing their blood.
Sounds charming.
Yeah. The other one is let me try and pronounce this correctly, Mananangao, which translates as self-segmenter. She's an older woman, again, quite attractive. But at night she grows wings and she can detach her upper body and fly about. And she particularly likes harassing pregnant women and sucking out their fetuses.
So
and you
nice.
can go, it's so nice, yeah. And you can pretty much go around the entire world like this. You know, you'll find similar stories everywhere. Both stories from history and from the present day. You know, one example I liked from 2012 was an incident in a Serbian village called Zarože, where the local council issued an official public health warning saying that a vampire was on the loose in the village. And it's been debated as to whether that warning was serious or whether it was kind of, I don't know, a ploy to generate a bit of local tourism or something. But in any case, quite a few of the locals took it seriously because there is a legend in Zarože about a powerful vampire called Sava Savanović, who's meant to have been imprisoned in the local mill there. His body was destroyed in a big fight with a vampire hunter, but it's believed that his spirit survived in the form of a butterfly, and the butterfly was trapped inside the mill. So then in 2012, the mill was demolished, and some of the townspeople just freaked out, you know, to the point where local grocers were kind of struggling to resupply the town with garlic because everyone was hanging it over their thresholds to try and keep
at least they profited from it then.
Well, exactly, yeah. You know, there's bound to be some benefit to the local.
I bet they might have started another rumour later.
Yeah, there could be a werewolf in Zarože right now as we speak.
Let me just say that again because I think I spoke over you. I bet they tried to start another rumour later.
Yeah, they probably did. Yeah, there's probably a werewolf running around Zarože as we speak. But I mean, the obvious question with all of this is why is it such an enduring belief, and where did it, you know, come from in the first place? There have been a ton of theories put forward, and some of them are kinder than others, I think we could say. I mean, a lot of people who research these sorts of things have concluded that, you know, people started believing in vampires because they were basically ignorant. You know? So they had, you know, limited knowledge of the world, like when traditional peoples who didn't know anything about meteorology invented weather gods and things like that. So I think we can call these the innocence theories. And in the case of vampires, one of the big innocence theories is the disease theory, like with the TB outbreaks in New England. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on that as an example of how these theories work. In 2013, you had a pretty interesting story emerging out of Poland. Archaeologists there reported that they'd found so-called vampire graveyards in the northwest of the country. There was a cemetery in a place called Drawsko, for example, where they dug up 6 corpses dating from the 17th and 18th centuries, 3 male, 3 female, and the corpses had huge stones like bricks jammed under their chins and sickles placed across their necks. And apparently the intention was to prevent these people from like rising out of the graves. If their corpses reanimated, then the rocks would prevent them from opening their jaws, and the sickles would decapitate them. And the Polish archaeologists had a few different ideas about who these people had been in their lives, because in 17th and 18th century Poland, various types of people were thought to be potential vampires, including immigrants, by the way. So, you know, a lot of 17th century Polish farmers probably would have voted for Donald Trump had he been around. But they analyzed the strontium isotopes in the corpse's teeth. And this can give you a pretty good idea of where someone comes from. And they found that these were all local people. But then they looked at the historical archives, and they found there'd been repeated cholera epidemics in the area at around the same time when these people were buried. And in the archaeological literature, there's been a long-standing connection between cholera and belief in vampirism. So that was kind of not their smoking gun exactly, but it became, the leading theory, because there so often is this connection. And in fact, it stretches right across Europe, from Ireland right across to Romania. And, in all of these places, lots of people thought that victims of any kind of epidemic were at risk of rising from the dead. So this is where a lot of these practices like hanging the garlic came from. And these are, by the way, this garlic hanging is an example of what are called apotropaic practices. That includes anything people do because they believe it can ward off evil. So it's all kinds of things. I'm sure you saw in Ukraine how some mothers tie a red ribbon around the wrists of their babies. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, I did see some of that.
Yeah, so it's to keep the evil eye away. And here in Kazakhstan, after you talk like baby talk to a child, you should pretend to spit. You go like t, and it's the same reason, to keep the evil away.
I noticed in the villages in Ukraine there is quite a lot of superstitious behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's like I say, it's really widespread, and so these are not dead beliefs, But actually, interestingly, the garlic thing is not as universal as Hollywood would have you believe. For example, in a lot of Romani communities, which are often associated with vampirism, they don't use garlic; they use turmeric. So it seems like evil spirits just really don't like strong food smells. You could probably throw an English vindaloo at the vampire and get pretty much the same reaction.
That's worth knowing.
It is. But I wanted to talk as well about Porfirio, which I know you've heard of. It's actually called the vampire disease. I think you've seen photos of Porfirio sufferers.
It looked it looked like they could also be zombies as well. It looked pretty awful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a horrific condition. It affects the hemoglobin in our blood, which is the stuff that kind of regulates the red pigment and carries oxygen, these kinds of fairly important functions. And there are broadly two kinds of porphyria. One is neurological, and that kind leads to brain disease and madness. And by the way, you might be intrigued to hear that this is a hereditary disease, and some scholars have suggested that King George III had it. And so if that's true, it would mean there could be a strain of vampire disease in the English royal family.
Well, there are other links to the royal family as well to do with vampires as well. I mean, as I've said before, and as I'll talk with Rosemary about this later, but Prince Charles is related to Vlad Tepes as well.
Yeah, that does seem to be true.
And we also spoke about the fact that it used to be a practice amongst the royal families to actually consume human flesh and blood because they believed it would keep them young. That was actually, some people actually do think it still carries on to this day, but that's obviously a bit more of a conspiracy theory.
Well, we can talk about another reason why that might be the case as well, a clinical neurological reason. Going back to porphyria briefly, though, the second type is cutaneous porphyria, and it is the one that you've seen the photos of. It affects the skin, especially after exposure to sunlight. But the other type is cutaneous porphyria, which is the one you've seen the photo of, and it affects the skin, especially after exposure to sunlight. And it has really startling effects. Like in some cases, it can make the skin around your mouth recede, so all your teeth kind of protrude outwards. And at the same time, you look kind of pallid, but you also have a reddish kind of color to your skin. And basically, like you said, you look dead. You look like a zombie.
It really does look nasty. I mean, anyone listening, can you spell that disease?
Yeah, it's Porphyria.
So people can Google that. Just look under Google Images and you'll see some examples there. It's pretty horrific.
It is. And the thing is, it's always billed as a rare condition. But if you look at the numbers, it affects about 1 in 25,000 people, which means there are about 300,000 sufferers worldwide. So say if like half of them have the cutaneous version and a third of those are acute, that would be 50,000 people worldwide who look an awful lot like vampires, especially after they go out in the sun. So, that's certainly, I think, a potential factor. But then you mentioned the blood drinking. There is a psychological condition called Renfield syndrome, which is sometimes called clinical vampirism. And essentially, it's an obsession with drinking blood. It's not listed in the DSM, the official journal of mental disorders, but you will find it in some criminal case files. Occasionally a police department will bring psychiatrists into a murder or an assault case to try and explain the attacker's bizarre behavior. And quite a number of those cases do involve drinking the victim's blood. And in some instances, Renfield's seems to be the cause. In fact, even the acid bath murderer, John George Haig, he practiced blood drinking rituals, and it seems like he might have had Renfield's. So yeah, as I said, disease might be one key to explaining the origin of this belief, but it's just one of many, which I guess we'll have to pursue in another episode.
I read about a guy called. Did you come across this guy, Jonathan Sharkey, as well?
I've heard this name. Who is this guy?
He ran for presidency apparently in the USA in 2012. He's an ex-wrestler, and he also drinks blood. And if he can't get human blood, he'll drink pig's blood, because he believes he's a vampire as well.
Can you imagine a blood-drinking president? My God. Wow.
I can. They probably, I'm sure behind closed doors, they all delve into that a little bit.
I want to move on to literature, though, because here you can actually see what vampires have represented to various cultures and people through time. And when certain figures keep turning up in our stories, like vampires do, it's because they really resonate with us for some reason. We generally create these characters for our own purposes. Sometimes they're based on things we see in the external world, and sometimes they're not. But generally, if they hang around for a while, it's because they're telling us something about ourselves. And in the case of monstrous images like the vampire, these usually come up because we're trying to externalize something unpleasant. So we might have an urge to do something a bit, morally questionable, or maybe we feel a particular emotion that we're not comfortable with, and so we create these monsters so that we can sort of examine ourselves from a comfortable distance. And sometimes it's interesting to see how these monsters actually develop through time, because societies develop and they need to understand different things about themselves as they go along. A good example of that was a short story called The Vampire, written by a guy called John Polidori, and it was published in 1819. It's sort of seen as a landmark because the vampire character in the story was based on Lord Byron. So kind of a handsome and dashing aristocrat, but a little on the edge, and a little on the dark side. And almost in the same year, there was a Russian short story also called The Vampire with a similar kind of character. He was, all charm and wit by day, but he was a monster by night. Before then, vampires had generally been kind of furry and hideous, and a lot of them only had one nostril, so not exactly dashing and handsome,
Yeah,
but these
doesn't quite sound like the Interview with a Vampire with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, does it?
Exactly, though I find Tom rather hideous personally, but anyway. But these new vampires sort of set the pattern for the 19th century. There was a kind of flood of vampire literature, and it mostly went with this kind of alluring stranger idea. And the change makes sense when you realize that it coincided with the Romantic era. I mean, just to take an Anglo-centric view of things for a second, if the BNP had been around in the 17th century, they would have been huge because most people would have identified with their views on foreigners. Yeah? But the Romantic age kind of reversed that. The more different and the more exotic you could be, the more you could get people intrigued and, a little bit aroused. So the Romantic era vampire sort of explored that whole fascination with the other and the exotic and the slightly kind of dark and mysterious, But then if you skip forward to the end of the 19th century, things had changed again. The Romantic period was over and the Victorian era was in full swing. And so in 1897, when Bram Stoker's Dracula came out, that took the whole vampire mythos to a new place. I mean, actually, this might seem surprising because the vampire in that book has been sanitized over time. But in the original, he was a truly monstrous, hideous, kind of hairy thing, right? But at the same time, the female characters, Lucy and Mina, they're definitely attracted to him. So we moved from like suave aristocrats seducing pretty young girls to an actual hairy monster seducing.
Sounds a bit like Beauty and the Beast.
Young girls. Yeah, except that again, Beauty and the Beast, I mean, if you look at any of the recent incarnations, he is sort of charming, you know, he's sort of like a well-dressed Chewbacca and well-spoken. But, you know, you can read a ton of interpretations of Dracula, and some of them will directly contradict what I'm going to say about it. But I agree with most people that there's a sexual metaphor in it. You know, in Victorian England, women were meant to be kind of dutiful wives who dutifully procreated and, you know, bore dutiful children to their husbands. And they definitely weren't meant to be into like sex for pleasure. Definitely not, you know, casual sex, which they engaged in because of lust. So this monster was female sexuality and desire, and it had to be ugly in Victorian England because the urges associated with it were considered ugly at the time. So comparing all of those stories, you can see how vampires, like many images, change to suit the social climate around them. And they're always telling us that there's unexplained and unacknowledged stuff, you know, in our culture that we need to deal with. And of course, now in 2016, there's plenty of stuff that we need to deal with. So there's plenty of room for monsters, you know. Just to add a personal note here, my favorite take on vampire lore was actually Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which aired in the 90s and the noughties. And that was a show that nobody took seriously when it started. But then, you know, 4 or 5 seasons into the run, it was the most written about TV series on American and British university campuses, because academics, especially, you know, psychologists and sociologists, they just loved all the layers that were kind of built into the story, and they loved how the monsters were always used to represent like the dilemmas of the human characters, and a lot of the issues, just like with Dracula and with Polidori's vampire. A lot of the issues were very contemporary. Like there were episodes about, you know, the changing structure of families and how to react if your best friend reveals they're in a same-sex relationship, things like this, you know. And it also carried a strong feminist message, but it was all kind of explored again through these classic images.
True Blood was a bit like that as well. Did you watch any of True Blood?
I only saw a little bit of True Blood. What was it? How was it? I mean, what was it like?
It was jam-packed full of really attractive people, particularly women. Or I tended to notice the women more, I suppose. Lots of sex, and they also showed the link between vampires and werewolves, but also kind of like a soap opera, going more into the psychology of things. And True Blood, basically, it was vampires and humans living together. In a sort of parallel universe that doesn't exist at the moment, but kind of imagining if vampires and humans were living together, and then examining the social issues that would arise in that case, you know.
Yeah, and I think there's an awful lot to be examined, you know. But before we wrap up and you hand over to Rosemary, I just wanted to mention one more thing. I was talking about this a few weeks ago to a friend here who's a Jungian analyst. And I asked her why she thinks vampires are so popular. And her answer I thought was worth repeating, though it was in Russian, so I hope I'm getting the main gist of it right. Basically, what she said was all beings, including like humans, angels, gods, demons, vampires, and so on, we all lie on a kind of spectrum, at one end of which is flesh, and at the other end is spirit. Yeah? And usually in mythology, that spectrum is represented by a tree. You've got, like, you know, in the Jewish Kabbalah, you've got the tree of life, which kind of maps out the various aspects of divinity. You've got, you know, Yggdrasil in Scandinavian mythology. You've got the tree of knowledge in Genesis, which a lot of people have said is the same tree. And all of these trees have upper branches in the heavens and then roots deep in the earth in the lower dimensions. These higher planes, where the upper branches of the tree are, they're composed of spirit. And the lower planes are completely physical worlds with no spirit. Whereas, like, where we are, we're somewhere in between, and it puts us in a weird position. Now, vampires and demons live in the lower realms, and there's no spirit at all, and they can never escape those realms because they're completely beholden to their physical needs. Of course, we know in the case of vampires, the main need is they need to feed themselves. They need to get blood, so they can never escape this physical need. Yeah. And the idea is we're sort of partly like that, but also partly spiritual. So of course we're attracted to stories about these trapped creatures because it helps us understand why we keep getting dragged back into this kind of lower aspect of ourselves. And by the way, if this is true, you'd expect that in very materialistic times, like now, you'd see more interest in these kinds of purely physical creatures, because unconsciously we kind of know that our materialism is leading us away from the spiritual aspect of ourselves. So these creatures who represent being trapped in a purely physical life sort of become more relevant to us.
That's pretty deep.
Thank you. That's depth psychology for you. It's in the name. Anyway, make of it what you will. But yeah, I think it's certainly worth bearing that kind of interpretation in mind. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much for giving us a bit of background on vampires. Should we go over and speak to Rosemary now?
Yeah, that was no trouble at all, Scott. Let's hear what Rosemary has to say.
Rosemary Ellen Guilley is an American researcher and author on topics related to spirituality and the paranormal. Topics include the jinn, shadow people, ETs, Nephilim, archons, reptilians, and other such entities. She's written more than 60 books, including 10 encyclopedias and books such as the Encyclopedia of Vampires, Werewolves, and Other Monsters, The Complete Vampire Companion, and Vampires Amongst Us. She's a very busy lady, and we're very grateful she's agreed once again to come and talk to us. Hi Rosemary, welcome back to Truth Sentinel. We chatted to you before about angels, the afterlife, Mothman, the jinn, and we did talk a bit about dreams, but it'd be good to chat a bit more about dreams in detail. First of all, I wanted to talk to you about vampires though. Before we talk about vampires, one thing I didn't ask you last time was how you got into writing about all these subjects that you write about.
Scott, it's been a long journey my entire life. As a kid, I became fascinated by these topics. I think a lot of kids do. They're interested in the occult and horror and the paranormal. I also had psychic experiences. Again, a lot of children do. But in many people, these interests just fall into the wayside as people get older and get more engaged in other things in life. But for me, they always stayed at the forefront. There are some very peculiar realities out there beyond ours that people have experiences in, and not evenly, but very consistent over the course of history. So basically, my personal interest then merged into my professional pursuits a little over 30 years ago. I have a background in journalism. I always wanted, however, to be an author, and I wanted really to investigate all of these things. So very happily, I was able to merge those two interests and become independent in 1983, and have done over 60 books to date. And I do a lot of investigations in the field, paranormal things and UFOs, mysterious creatures. I also work in the metaphysical arena. I've done energy healing and psychic readings, past life regressions, things like that. So it's a multifaceted career that keeps me constantly on the move and constantly engaged in a lot of very fascinating topics, which always are interconnected and sometimes in very strange ways. You know, you can really do the 6 degrees of separation with almost any of these topics, whether or not they're on the dark and scary side or whether they're on the more uplifting, mystical side.
Right, yeah, you do cover some very varied topics. I'm in Thailand at the moment, and I was recently attacked by a swarm of blood-sucking insect vampires, commonly called mosquitoes. You've studied vampires on a much deeper level. How much is there to learn about vampires, and how far back in history does it go to find out about the original vampires and how and where they actually came from? Is it Bram Stoker, or is it much further back than that?
It really goes much further back than that. In mythology and folklore, there are vampiric entities in folklore that go back to ancient times. There are stories of vampiric human beings, you know, the returning dead who are vampiric in nature. And the fictional vampire has taken some distinct dramatic turns away from the folklore vampire, which is understandable. We now have a very well-established vampire, living vampire subcommunity, which in turn has taken its own direction even yet. And so all of these things combine to make a fascinating field of study. Vampires are one of my favorite topics, oddly, along with afterlife studies and angels and dreams. It doesn't seem like those all go together, but they do in rather odd ways. And what I like about vampires is the same thing that I like about angels, is it's a very complex field with a lot of depth and a lot of, I want to say, uncertainty to it. That is, things are never black and white when it comes to the spirit realm. There are good angels and bad angels. In addition to, in Christianity, the fallen angels. Bad angels are not necessarily the fallen angels. And so it is in vampires. There are no clear-cut answers as to exactly what a vampire is, other than it is a human being or a dead person, a discarnate person, or a non-human entity that is capable of withdrawing vital life force from the living. And that could be a human being, it could be an animal, it could even be in the natural world in plants. And that is the broadest definition of a vampire. After that, the field becomes very complex, and there are many overlaps of definitions of vampires, culture to culture, time to time. Sometimes the terminology is indistinct, different terms applied for entities with clearly a vampiric nature, but they're not called vampires, they are called something else. And so the vampire has what I would call a constellation of characteristics, all of which do not necessarily apply in any given case, but dominant ones apply from case to case throughout history, the dominant one being that the vampire substantially withdraws vital life force energy in some way from the living, and that's not always through blood.
So that's the common theme. What about things like fangs and pale skin? Is that something that's more related to the fictional character, or does that have links to the folklore as well?
We can thank fiction for a lot of these embellishments, and frankly, canine fangs just really would never do the job anyway. In the human mouth, they're set too far apart to do anything other than maybe tear flesh a bit. They're not going to puncture jugular veins in the way that they are portrayed in films. The film that most accurately portrays what fangs would be necessary for a vampire to leave those little bite marks on the neck is the silent version of Nosferatu, where the vampire, the Nosferatu, which is a made-up word, by the way, has what are really essentially rat fangs. They're the two front teeth very close together, and something like that would, if they were sharp enough, would be capable of penetrating tissue and muscle and even cartilage. So there are a lot of fanciful elements in the vampire myth that have been taken in popular culture to be fact. Accounts of fangs and pale faces are really fictional elements, not factual ones. There are accounts where people claim that their blood was taken by some returning dead. In most cases, they've been pounced upon, like the old hag syndrome, choked and suffocated at night, maybe even sexually pestered or violated, and they then begin to suffer a wasting away. So there's not a direct connection with a blood taking, but just a withdrawal of the life force by this vampire that affects their health. They become, in some cases, then fatally ill, and they die. In other cases, vampires, they will kill off your livestock. They will take the beauty off your face. If you live high in the mountains and you need body fat to survive, they'll take your body fat, not your blood. So we have to look at vampires in a much broader context than just what has been dished out through film and fiction. And it's the film and fiction elements which were initially adopted by the living vampire community as traits and characteristics that vampires should have. If they were not pale, then they put on white makeup. They might have emphasized sharpened teeth, or even sharpened up their teeth a little or gotten caps for it. many experiments in drinking blood, which have been largely unsuccessful for a lot of people. We're not built to drink blood in any significant quantity. And I think that today's living vampire community has more or less come to terms with what it means to be a vampire. That's not necessarily the Dracula model. It's something else. It could be an energy vampire. There are sanguinarians. There are people who do like to participate in blood sharing and blood drinking. But it's not like the vampire Lestat, where you're going to drain somebody of nearly all their blood and then pump some of yours back in, and voila, they're an eternal vampire. These are fictional elements.
And one of the fictional ideas of vampires obviously came from Bram Stoker. Some years back, I went to Romania and spent a long day on a journey through Transylvania to see the home of Vlad Tepes. Have you looked into the story of Vlad and how he came to be a source of inspiration for Dracula?
Yes, I did, Scott, and I did take a trip to Romania myself some years ago. I loved it. Beautiful countryside, Castle Dracula and the Borgo Pass, nothing like what Stoker described. He was using the Swiss Alps as a model. He'd never been to Romania or Transylvania in his life, and Borgo Pass is quite pastoral compared to the book. But Tepes is a very intriguing historical character. He was bloodthirsty in nature. He lived at a time where if rulers were not violent and cruel and really tough on their competition, they just didn't survive. And so he wasted no time dealing very harshly with his subjects who displeased him and his enemies. He is not known historically as a blood drinker. There's not a shred of historical evidence that he sat around and drank blood, even though in many cultures drinking the blood of victims is a way of acquiring their strength. It's a ritual thing, not a necessarily a vampire thing. But he did impale people on stakes, and he whipped and tortured them, and there are stories of him nailing hats to heads. So when diplomats displeased him, he nailed their turbans to their heads. He was very cruel to a lot of people. And Stoker really liked his name. When he had to come up with a really good name for his central character, Dracula kind of rolls off the tongue in a very exotic way, and it has a meaning. It means son of the devil. And that was applied to Tepes as a descriptor of his cruel behavior, that, here was a man who was so nasty, so cruel, he had to be the son of the devil. And his father was called Dracul, his father who ruled before him, Dracul, the devil, and so Vlad Tepes became son of the devil. And it really was an artful choice for a name because it is quite exotic. And then Stoker, like any good novelist, he took a little bit of history, he did some research, he loosely modeled Count Dracula on Tepes as, an old warlord, royal blood, and he took it from there. But you have to realize with fiction that in most cases it's a little bit of fact and then a lot of embellishment in order to make a good story.
Yeah, and there seems to be a link as well between vampires and royalty a little bit. I know Prince Charles is closely related to Vlad, and I recently saw a book by Dr. Richard Sugg, who claims that in the 18th century the British royals consumed flesh amongst other parts of the human body because they were believed to be a therapeutic agent, and some people even think that carries on to this day. Have you seen it? Have you found any connection between vampires and royalty?
I have seen those reports, and it would not surprise me if practices like that still go on today. They certainly went on in the past, but you have to keep in mind that these very ancient practices of consuming the flesh and the blood of victims has to do with acquisition of character traits and strength, and it's also symbolic of conquering someone. So it's not, I don't view these things as being vampires per se, like predatory entities that have to feed on flesh and blood, or especially blood, in order to survive. it has an entirely different context. And so it would not surprise me if in Western society these sorts of practices went on. It would have had a much different ritual significance as a way of maintaining power. And if they still go on today, it wouldn't surprise me either, because in many other societies around the world, those types of rituals still do take place. And even here in America, certain Native Americans practice that as well, consuming your departed victim that you conquered, as first of all, establishes that you've completely conquered them, but you are also absorbing their qualities into you, their strength, their intelligence, whatever. It's a way of absorbing something. And so I really don't think the two can be cross-purposed, that you can't say that because a society practices flesh and blood drinking that, well, technically that is vampiric because it is partaking of the blood and the life force, but it's not in the same context at all.
Yeah, who knows what goes on behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace, eh? In modern times, vampires have become quite sexy with the help of movies such as Interview with a Vampire and series such as True Blood and Twilight. Were vampires always considered sexy, or is this another fictional trait?
It is another fictional trait. And here again, Scott, when you read some of the old accounts, there are myths and stories of beautiful, enticing vampires, but they're really more stories rather than accounts of actual encounters. And with the advent of vampires entering the performing arts, entertainment, and the literary arts, then the vampires started becoming more alluring. And Varney the Vampire is a very good example of that. Mid-19th century, preceded Count Dracula. He was an aristocrat, and women were very attracted to Varney the Vampire. And, eventually he, in despair, throws himself into a volcano and does himself in. But here is an aristocrat who makes his way through all the upper circles and is a dashing, a very charismatic fellow. And even the Count becomes very groomed and polished by the time he gets to England. When Jonathan Harker encounters him in his castle in Transylvania, he's old and repulsive and ugly, has hairy palms and sharp nails that are more like claws. There's nothing really attractive about him, but once he gets rejuvenated in England, then he's very polished. And by the time Dracula hit the stage and the screen, and it was in that transition to the stage and the screen where the vampire really got dressed up. He's in tuxes and top coats and tails and, the stovepipe hats. He's quite the upper crust looking person. And this sort of allure became very popular, understandably, in fiction, where you had the allure of something very appealing, glamorous, attractive, and exotic, and underneath it was something very sinister and horrific. Unfortunately, that has been carried to extremes, and the vampire Lestat was a very prettied-up vampire, and I loved Anne Rice's early books, and I think she did quite well developing the characters of Louis and the vampire Lestat and the coterie of vampires around them. But she also influenced subsequent vampires to be even more glamorous. And by the time we get to Twilight, the vampires are so glammed up and wimpy that they're not even scary anymore. And the whole teen vampire thing with the Vampire Diaries, the Blue Bloods, the Vampire Academy, Twilight et al., these are glammed up vampires to appeal to teenagers and even preteens. And so all the horror really has been literally vampirized right out of them. And I think that we're in a recovery mode now where the vampire is swinging back a bit to be a little closer to its original roots.
And what about modern-day vampires? I know in your books you looked into those a bit. Did you manage to meet any, or how much did you find out about people who believe they're vampires, and do they actually drink blood?
There are people who actually... I didn't hear the first part of the question. I guess you're asking me if I met real vampires?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Okay. Yes, I have met people who consider themselves to be genuine vampires, and of different types and classes. When I was working on my first book on vampires, Vampires Among Us, and that was in the late 1980s, vampires were still very much an underground thing. And most of the people that I encountered seemed to feel that in order to be a vampire, they had to emulate characteristics and traits found largely in fiction. And so they were night people, or they became night people. If they were not allergic to garlic, they became allergic to garlic. They didn't like sunlight. Blood drinking became quite problematic for a lot of them because, as I mentioned earlier, the human body is not engineered to drink large quantities of blood, small quantities, but any significant quantity, and people do have different tolerance levels. It's an emetic. You throw up. So this is a rather unfortunate handicap for someone who thinks that in order to be a vampire, they have to start subsisting on blood. So over the course of time, there have been a lot of changes in the vampire community, and I think Anne Rice had a very big impact on that as well. The psi-vampires, or psychic vampires, started coming more to the front. People who felt that in order to be healthy, they had to take life force energy off other people, and that's done through energy, not just blood. So you have the sanguinarians who are blood drinkers, and for some of them it's just a very small amount of blood. It's more of a significator than an actual element in survival. And a community that started defining itself in terms of who they were as a part of society, whether or not they had any ancient roots, that is, are there human beings going back to ancient times who also fit this living vampire definition. And that community is still in development and flux with a lot of different factions in it. There have been manuals of vampire behavior and clubs, codes of ethics, some of them looking to mythology to find explanations for living vampires today. And so they've redefined themselves even to be distinct from the folklore vampires and even fictional vampires.
And I think I read in one of your books, one of the African forms of vampires drinks coconut water if there's no blood available, and that got me a bit worried, as coconut water is one of my favourite drinks. That's also very healthy. Was that something you wrote about in one of your books?
It is, Scott, and here again, it gets down to what is important for survival to the local people. And in Africa, I can speculate that the coconut vampire, to go around and drink up all the coconut milk, is a way of attacking people at their most vital place. And that's really what the vampire does. Like I was saying earlier, I came across accounts in folklore where communities who raised bees for a living, if the bees all got struck with an epidemic and died or didn't produce honey, they blamed it on vampires. It was their livelihood. And if their crops got blasted, that was a vampire. And so many different ways to look at vampires. And in examining the worldwide folklore, there are similar accounts like that, where whatever is important to a community or a local society, if they lose that in a devastating way, then that's a vampire attack. There's a whole class of vampires, for example, in South America, in Peru, mostly Peru, also Ecuador and Bolivia, but mostly Peru, where you've got a lot of people living in very high altitudes in the Andes. And there are a number of vampires who have different names, who don't take blood, they take your body fat. And while we here in the West think that sounds like a great diet vampire, when you consider the harsh conditions there and the fact that these people probably don't have a lot of food to live on, they have to endure very harsh climates, and especially in the winter. Well, if you have no body fat, then that really affects your ability to withstand cold and harsh conditions. And so that jeopardizes your life. So it's very interesting how relative the vampire becomes from different viewpoints, and it all boils down to the same thing. A living person, a discarnate person, or a non-human entity, and there are far more non-human vampires than human vampires, that takes the life force, and by so doing, then imperils the ability of the living to maintain life and to prosper.
And so how would someone defend themselves against real vampires or psychic vampires or any of the other types? Are any of the old stories of garlic and crucifixes, do you think any of those are they fictional, or are they based on folklore?
It's a combination, and there are remedies all over the world. Every culture has their own remedy against anything evil and unwanted. They range from using things in the natural environment to various amulets, various colors. The whole crucifix thing was more of a Christian implant on a pagan vampire cult, because the vampire cult preceded the spread of Christianity in Europe, and the Christian church, in taking over paganism, either had to demolish pagan beliefs or subsume them in some way. And the church had a very difficult time stamping out the vampire cult in Eastern Europe and all those remote little pockets. People believed in vampires, and they were going to go dig up graves and identify people and then mutilate the bodies in order to stop the vampirism. And so the church tried to apply their own rules on that, well, you had to have the church do it had to be sanctioned by the church. These symbols of the church then became the way to deal with evil, and the only way to deal with evil, calling upon the names of Jesus and occasionally Mary, other religious figures. In other words, it had to be done the Christian way, and so that became grafted onto the vampire cult. Why should a crucifix work if people are not Christian? And yet that now has become a staple in vampire fiction and film, that the symbol of the cross will work against vampires. Well, in a broader context, in demonology in general, and frankly anything evil, of course the Christian church teaches that if you adhere to the faith of the religion and you rely upon the symbols of that faith, then you have a weapon against any kind of evil. So I don't think the crucifix has any greater power over vampires than any of the remedies employed by other cultures. You have people believing in their remedies and having used them probably for centuries in very effective ways.
Thanks, Rosemary. I'm gonna edit this bit out, but I'm just gonna ask one last question just about your website, and then I'll wind that one down and move on to dreams, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, so the last question is, so do you have any particular sections on your website covering vampires, Rosemary?
I have my website, visionaryliving.com, and it's undergoing reconstruction right now. And so I will say that in the near future, there will be an expanded section on vampires and werewolves, two of the topics that I still follow in my research. And those will feature some excerpts from some of my books, as well as Q&As that I address in my newsletter on those topics.
Okay, thanks very much. So thanks for joining us and talking about vampires, and we'll be chatting to you again very, very soon about dreams.
Well, thank you, Scott. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. Remember, you can contact us at scottsentinel9@gmail.com if you want to suggest any guests or topics. Also, visit our website www.truthsentinel.co.uk, and you can leave a voicemail there which we'll put on the show. There's also a chat room there. You can leave articles if you'd like us to look at some articles. And you'll find all the episodes there as well if you've missed any past episodes. Truth Sentinel and Truth Sentinel 2. There's 2 channels. Please subscribe. Also, please donate if you can. We really appreciate it. We need to upgrade some equipment. You can also buy t-shirts at trutht-shirts.com. That's trutht-shirts.com. And use the code TRUTH1 to get a 10% discount, and that means we also get a small donation. Okay, thank you very much, and have a good week. Goodbye.